Welcome to Nadir Audio. In today's video, we're going to take a look at this Technics SL-1500C direct drive turntable. So let's get started. So I've actually never owned a Technics turntable before, but I do have some experience with them going all the way back to the late 80s when I had a radio show in college. And the studio there used SL-1200 Mark IIs, and similarly a friend of mine had a radio show at a nearby college. They used the same turntables there. We were both really impressed with them at the time. They have really solid build quality and are a real pleasure to use. And that sort of planted the seed that I might want to buy a Technics turntable someday. And then in the late 90s, I had some friends that were DJs that had the two turntables and a mixer set up. Got to play around with those a little bit. Those were also 1200s. And I thought back then that it might be a fun experiment to put one of those DJ turntables in a hi-fi setup, but I never did it back in the day. But then in recent years, I've become interested in Technics turntables again as a way to easily try out different phono cartridges, which is something I've been doing more of recently and is difficult to do on a turntable like my U-Turn Orbit. So with these S-shaped tone arms with the S mount, you can just plug in a head shell. And similarly, the 1500C allows you to adjust the vertical tracking angle, which means that you can try out a lot of different types of cartridges, and it just makes it a lot easier to do. And so that led me to want to buy a 1500. Now you may be wondering why I didn't get one of the G series Technics turntables specifically made for audiophiles. And really it just comes down to price. So the 1200G and the 1300G were already out of my price range before the prices went up this year. And I did briefly consider the 1200 GR2, but I would have had to save up for a long time, and I wasn't really sure that I was going to like the Technics enough to want to continue to use one. I just really wanted to try one out, and I didn't want to have to save up for several months for something that I might not end up using in the long term. And so the 1500C was a nice middle ground. It was the entry-level Technics turntable. There is a less expensive one now for around $900, but it doesn't have the VTA adjustment like the 1500C does. So I think this one overall is a really good choice. Now the SL-1500C has gone up in price too, along with all of the other Technics turntables in their range. And at the time of the making of this video, most places are selling it for $14.99. Now I got mine a few months ago at Sweetwater for the original retail price of $12.99, which is still a fair amount of money for an entry-level turntable. And I'm calling it entry-level because it includes a built-in phono preamp and an Ortofon 2M Red cartridge, which is pre-mounted to a compatible head shell. So it has everything you need to get started right out of the box. And I will say, I tried the built-in preamp and it's not bad, but I highly recommend getting an external preamp like the inexpensive Manny 2, which I reviewed earlier this year. And similarly, I upgraded the 2M Red stylus to a 2M Blue, which I also highly recommend. I also reviewed that particular upgrade earlier this year, and I'll include a link to both of those videos in the description below. But all that said, I do think the 1500 has a few advantages over other entry-level turntables that justify its higher price. For example, the heavy aluminum plinth, the advanced direct drive motor, which is shared with some of the other more expensive turntables in their range, and just a generally high level of build quality. Now, at the new price of $14.99, there are some competing turntables I would consider. For example, the Music Hall Stealth at $16.99, which also has VTA adjustment and comes with an upgraded 2M Blue cartridge. But overall, I'm really happy with the 1500 at the MSRP at which I originally bought it. So all the comparisons I've been doing in this video are between the SL-1500C with the upgraded Ortofon 2M Blue stylus and my U-Turn Orbit, also with the Ortofon 2M Blue. Now, you'll notice at the moment there's a 2M Red stylus on the Orbit, and that's because I didn't actually purchase an extra 2M Blue stylus. I don't plan on having both of these turntables with the 2M Blue long term, so I've just been swapping my one 2M Blue stylus back and forth as I do A/B comparisons, and with this particular cartridge it's really easy to do, so it's not a big deal. Now from the turntables, we've been running into my Music Hall Analog A3 Hybrid Tube preamp, and I did do a video on this earlier this year. This is a really great phono preamp, so you might want to check that out. I'll include a link in the video description below. And then from the preamp, we're going into my Saga preamp, and then into the Vidar power amp, and then we are still using the Triangle Bro 3 speakers, which have worked really well with all of these setups. So when I first got the SL-1500C, I unboxed it, put it together, followed the setup instructions that were included, and it took about 30 minutes from unboxing to actually playing records. And then I used it as my sole turntable for a couple of months. And the first things that stood out in these early days were increased detail and more dynamics. And these weren't subtle changes, they were very noticeable compared to what I was used to. And this led me to go back through a lot of the records in my collection to see if I had been missing anything that the Orbit wasn't able to retrieve, and the answer was a resounding yes. So let's talk about a few of those pressings. So one of the records where I noticed a big difference was on this Deutsche Grammophon 180-gram reissue of Mahler's First Symphony by the Bavarian Radio Symphony Orchestra, conducted by Raphael Kubelik. And when I play this on the Orbit with the 2M Blue, it's very pleasant sounding with clarity and some room sound, decent imaging. The soundstage goes to the edges of the speakers and just behind the wall. But it doesn't seem like a very dynamic recording, especially compared to some of the ones we've discussed in recent videos, the Living Stereo reissues, for example. But when I switch to the SL-1500C, we get a deeper and wider soundstage, also a bit taller. We get more detail, more room sound, more air. The imaging gets more precise. Everything seems a little bit more 3D, more dimensionality. The instruments have more density, so they seem a little bit more realistic. And I also started tapping my toes and bobbing my head to certain sections, so I think that the jump factor is pretty good. And then, yeah, a lot more dynamics. So the difference between the quiet passages and the more bombastic sections is really noticeable in this recording, and I wasn't getting that at all on the Orbit. So this is actually a much better record than I previously thought, and the same cartridge on the 1500C was able to pull out all of this additional information, which is pretty cool. Another record where I noticed a big difference on the 1500C was on Allan Holdsworth's Sand. Now this is an original pressing from the 80s on Relativity Records that I recently picked up at the Fall 2025 Austin Record Convention, and it is also a much better recording than I previously thought based on the digital files I own of this record. So when I listen to it on the Orbit, it has okay imaging. There's a relatively shallow sound stage. Everything sounds a little bit ethereal. It's clear, there's good clarity, but a little bit brittle and maybe two-dimensional. Now when I switch to the SL-1500C, we get more weight and density, a fuller sound, and the drums were just more realistic sounding instead of just sounding like percussive elements in space. Everything was more detailed. There was better, more realistic reverb in the recording, better imaging, deeper soundstage, which was wider and actually much deeper. So overall, everything sounded a lot better on the 1500C. And there also was an issue when I was playing this record on the Orbit where track 3 on side 1 would skip at the point where the guitar and Gary Husband's drums get really frenetic. Now this is a near mint copy of this record and there are no scratches, so I think it may just be an issue with the pressing itself, but there's no anti-skate on the Orbit. But when I switched to the 1500C, it had no problem playing this, and I didn't even have to change the anti-skate. I should mention that the tracking force is exactly the same for this cartridge on both turntables, and the anti-skate on the 1500 was just set to the same value as the tracking force per the instructions in the manual. So I didn't have to do anything special, it just didn't have that problem when playing on the 1500C. But overall, yeah, I was very impressed with how it sounded, and there was a real difference between the two turntables. So one last record I want to talk about is this reissue of the Diva soundtrack, which is a collection of tracks that vary in sound quality from okay to quite good, and I was concerned that the SL-1500C might emphasize some of its flaws, but I was pleasantly surprised. So on the opening track, Lawali, for example, you get slightly more detail on the vocals. There's more reverb on the really emotionally engaging vocals on this. You get a bit more string articulation. The strings in the orchestra on this track tend to kind of blend together, whereas with the 1500C you get a little bit more of that separation. You can tell a little bit that there's separate strings in separate areas, and there's a little bit better imaging on it as well. And then on the Satie tracks, the piano is just more lifelike. It sounds like it's actually in a room. On the Orbit, the tone was just fine, and it's a beautiful recording, but it sounds better on the 1500C. On track 3, which is the kind of more of a rock production, it's just a more muscular version, and you do get more detail. You're hearing more things in the recording that you didn't hear with the Orbit. And just in general, there's deeper soundstage. There's a track, the second to last track on the first side, where there is a snare drum that is accompanying an accordion, which is the primary instrument on that track, and it really sounds much more lifelike on the 1500, and I was hearing a texture on it that I had never heard before, which is really kind of amazing. So again, the tracks like that track that are really pretty good quality, yeah, you get a lot more from the 1500. On the other ones, yeah, it's able to pull out a little bit more. It's a more subtle change than you're getting with some of these other recordings, but it's still there. I still prefer to listen to Diva on the 1500. So overall, I'd say the 1500 is quite a step up from the Orbit in terms of sound quality, and that really shouldn't be a surprise at around 4 times the cost. I think the Orbit is still a good quality starter turntable, and I still highly recommend it. But the 15C is definitely at a higher level, so I'm really looking forward to trying out some different cartridges with it over the next few months, and seeing what it can do with some other styles of music, some new recordings, so we'll definitely be revisiting it. But I think that's it for now, guys, so thanks so much for watching, and I will see you all in the next video.